Hello and welcome to Open Source Governance. This is your host Pendar and you're listening to the 6th episode of this podcast. For this episode I have invited Florian Cramer to discuss populism with me. Before I get to the conversation, I would like to ask you to listen through the whole episode because by the end of the episode there are a number of announcements that are important to listen to. During our conversation, we cover everything from different types of populism, contemporary examples and less contemporary examples of populism and populist leaders. We will also discuss Dutch politics and COVID restrictions. I'm very happy to have Florian over for this episode because Florian has a deep understanding and a lot of knowledge over this topic, and he has researched this for many years during his research practice. Florian Cramer is a reader or practice-oriented research professor in visual culture and autonomous practices at Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He has written a large number of critical essays throughout his career, which encompassed both DIY publishing and academic writing since 1980s. Florian investigates transformation of cultural production, no matter whether they take place in institutional art systems or in popular culture. That's why he has been interested in meme culture for more than a decade. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Florian Cramer on the 15th of April 2022. Okay, Florian, thank you very much for being with me. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. For this episode, like I told you, we're going to talk about populism and right-wing movements, and we'll get to the topics as we go. So I just want to mention that I first attended one of your lectures.
Okay.
In back a few years ago about alt-right and 4chan. It was a really nice lecture. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm actually, we are colleagues at Autonomous Practices, and we are teaching. I am teaching your text to the first year student.
Oh my goodness, yes.
What is autonomy, which is a really nice text. A lot of the students are really connecting with this text, and so these two gave me the idea of having you over to talk about populism, which is the topic that was also talked about in the last week.
I should also mention that, as your colleague at Willem de Kooning Academy, we had a whole minor, or you could say a semester project on populism twice, actually, in the minor visual culture, together with Jan van Heemst, who is now retired. So it's actually something that we also worked with students. And also in relation, for example, populism and meme culture, which is something that really links to the practice of students in an art school.
Right. Mm-hmm. So maybe it would be interesting to see, like, how did you come to follow this topic of alt-right and meme culture, mm-hmm. and the history behind it, the online movements and activism around it?
Yeah, it's a little bit biographical because I grew up as a teenager in the 1980s in West Berlin. Back then it was still divided. And I really grew up in this kind of post-punk culture of the 1980s. And you could say the alt-right already existed there. So punk was, nowadays it's mostly seen as a kind of left anarchist movement, but you always had also the fascist elements in it. And then by the end of the 80s, it was more separated than into punk and skinhead culture, where it was clear cut. But in the 80s, it was much more ambiguous. And there was also, a lot of playing with fascist symbols, for example, with swastikas and British punk, etc., etc. And some people took that very literally, right? So in that sense, it's nothing new. And then when the alt-right phenomenon came up with the first Trump election in 2016, we had already done some research on meme culture, on image boards, also on troll campaigns before, and you could see there were many people who were simply not able to connect the dots, who were not able to read it. And it was a repetition of my teenage years. In my teenage years, I was in a class, and let's say we had maybe in a class of 30 people, there were like 3 people who were neo-Nazis, but our teachers thought that they were left-wing punks because they looked like left-wing punks. And exactly the same thing was happening again with the alt-right in 2016. But in the meantime, again, this whole thing has shifted. And we haven't seen it again right during the COVID protests and the COVID denier movement. There you saw these dancing hippies on the streets, and people also couldn't make sense of it. Why are these people who look like they're coming, I don't know, from a hippie commune of the 1960s, why are they dancing on the streets with fascists? And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually something very interesting to I would like to get there, but maybe we can already talk about it, because a lot of tools and ways of working that are used by the right, people who are active in the, let's say, the right or the nationalist kind of, or like whatever.
In Europe, it's really fascism. I would say it's really fascism, and yes, and it's dressing it up again in kind of different clothes and fashions, but in the end, it's let's say the old fascist movement which takes on new shapes.
Yeah,
and also which has a strategy of kind of disguising itself, or not calling itself fascist, and then once appearing as punks or as hippies in order to create confusion about itself, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that the kind of tools that are used by the fascist groups are departing from this mostly civil rights activist groups that are trying to kind of have deliver a new message through like the new tools that they discovered. Mostly in the 60s or 70s, these communes were made, and the hippie culture, and later the punk culture. So all of these like autonomous kind of groups that started to get together and mobilize and try to create a new way of working or thinking, or alternative ways, let's say, that usually undermine the mainstream.
Yes,
are now used by the fascist groups.
Yeah, but I would also question this kind of historical narrative, because if you look, for example, at 1960s counterculture and then American hippie culture, right? Then you have a film, for example, a cult film like Easy Rider with Dennis Hopper. But what is this film about? It's about the Hells Angels, and the Hells Angels always have been a white supremacist outlaw bikers club. They've always been on the right. Or another example is the Charles Manson family. Yeah, what was the Charles Manson family about? It was also about white supremacism. It was all the murders were instigated by a kind of racial hatred. That was the ultimate motivation. So you could say the fascist elements were already there in the 1960s counterculture. And a book or a source that I'm often referring to, which I think kind of beautifully sums it up, is the novel The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, which talks about a kind of underground organization that operates as an underground postal network, courier network. It's almost the anticipation of what we nowadays have with, I don't know, peer-to-peer networks and also alternative forms of dissemination. But the novel was written in 1966, 1967, but there the neo-fascists are also part of that counterculture, of this countercultural fabric or web, right? So, yeah, I would question that. I think they always have been part of these movements. Only the question is, to which degrees have they been in the fringes? Yeah? And then, for example, at fringes that also overlap with esoteric beliefs. And esotericism in general, and to which degree do they have a hegemony? Also, if you look at the beginning of counterculture movements in Western Europe, then you really have to start with the German life reform movement of the early 20th century, where people like, for example, Walter Benjamin came from, but which was also the birth of modern fascism, at the same time. And that's why Hitler was a vegetarian. And even that Hitler branded his form of fascism National Socialism was such a clever kind of memeing strategy, because socialism was something left. So and he said, okay, we are also socialists, but we're National Socialists. It's the same kind of strategy, right?
So it's like, let's say, just how you wrap how you wrap it and present it as a populist. There was a really successful example, I would say.
Yes, I think what you have to do is strategically, you have to kind of cut through the ideological expectations. You have to present something that your adversaries or your enemies don't expect. And then you can take them by surprise. And that's, for example, by calling your fascist movement socialist or whatever.
Yeah, maybe this is then a good shift to speaking about mainstream and establishment. So for decades now, after the war, establishment and mainstream are kind of are what we know as the only single way of working for the society, right? So let's say the governments in the West are known to be conducting certain ways of organizing that is known now as the mainstream. And for the populist, or let's say the modern populist, is the way of... So the undermining this mainstream is always interesting for the populace, for the people.
Yes, but I would say that's maybe a rather new development, and maybe that's also something that only really broke through in the late 1990s. So, for example, in the Netherlands with Pimp, that you could say in the whole post-war period, there was still a unity between mainstream and populism. Politics themselves were quite populist. European post-war politics were quite populist.
Right.
And I only know it from the country where I grew up, in Germany. If you were from the populist right, then you still felt part of the mainstream, also of the political mainstream, especially the conservative mainstream. Right. And that is something, you could say, an alliance that broke up. But maybe this is the point where we also need to define what populism actually is, because it's really difficult. There is political theory by Karlsruhe, for example, who then simply defines it as it's, let's say, a discourse that frames the virtuous people against the corrupt elite. That's often the most common assumption, right? But then you also have political philosophies of populism that defend populism as a strategy, for example, by Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. And you see that, for example, left populist parties such as Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain were actually influenced by these political philosophies, by this, and they had their origins actually in South American leftist populist or popular movements of the 1970s. So I think the problem is that the term populist is not very sharp. It's not very clear, because populism could simply mean, we're standing up for the people, we are standing up for the people who are not represented, or there is a discrepancy between what, let's say, the multitude or the community of people is in the streets and the people who are running things.
Right. Us and them.
Yes, but you can also interpret it, because populism means, an ism of the people, or an ism that is concerned with the people. You can also interpret this in ethnic nationalist terms. That you, for example, say, well, the people, that's, for example, the Dutch people and the white Dutch people, right? And we are the people, and, for example, the immigrants are not the people. So, and also the people in the sense of actually the mainstream. Like, for example, we as the people, we are 90% heterosexual, so the minorities, they should shut up, So that is also a form of populism, and that is also what you see in these right-wing populist movements. So, for example, also during the Corona crisis, basically the right-wing populist discourse was, a few people die, but the majority cannot live their lives. And the majority is the people, so the people is getting suppressed, by a minority. Which is a kind of social Darwinist. It has these elements of social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest, and also right of the stronger person. That can also be a form of populism.
Right.
But then, if you say, for example, like political theory says, it's the framing of the virtuous people against the corrupt masses, then you can also say all the revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe, for example, in 1989, or the Arab Spring, were populist insurgencies. Because they all worked with that narrative, and rightfully so. So is something, do you delegitimize something, or do you say populism is bad? Only so is, for example, was the Arab Spring wrong, or were the Eastern European uprisings against Stalinist communism, were they wrong because they used the narrative of the virtuous people against the corrupt elites? The elites were corrupt, right? So they were right. So that's often a problem with these kind of liberal theories of populism, that they do not take into account that actually the elites can be corrupt, and that there can be a justified populist uprising.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, if you think about it, all revolutions are coming from populist uprisings. So, I mean,
I agree. Yes.
The kind of rhetoric that is trying to tag certain things good or bad. In that sense, I agree with you that populism is not necessarily a negative thing. It is just a way of mobilizing.
Yes.
Right. And that's really interesting to hear about all of your different definitions of populism. And
maybe I can also add something from my own German experience, also having grown up in this kind of so-called reunification period. So I was 20 when the war came down.
Sorry, you were in the east of
West. I grew up in West Berlin.
Berlin, okay.
Yes, but also part of my family lived in East Berlin.
Okay.
So the slogan of the East Germans who went on the street to demonstrate and protested in 1989 was, "We are the people." That was the slogan of the revolution. We are the people. And you can say let's say it's the core of populism, to say we are the people and you, the central country, are not. But what you see nowadays is, I mean, in the same region, East Germany is now really in the hands of the extreme right. It's really under I would say a hegemony, discursive hegemony of the extreme right. And for example, with the Pegida protests, also the Corona denier movement there, they reuse that slogan to say we are the people, and it means we are the East German white ethnic German people, and you who do not fit in, you are not. You have no rights. So. It's always been a kind of double-edged sword. This kind of, you could say maybe populism is something that assumes that the people have a natural right. And that's a really double-edged sword because it can very easily become a kind of fascist trope and narrative.
True.
And ideology. Yes.
But it's interesting to see every time the kind of usage of this word, the people, like by the leaders, by the people who have a charisma or they have something new to say. They are alternative leaders or alternative thinkers or people who kind of the mass, or like people who think they're underrepresented, they look at, is that they always refer to the people. So they declare that they are coming from the voice of the people. And it of course helps that the background is a little bit maybe...
Yes and no. Huh? In that respect, I find, for example, Pimp a really interesting figure. By the way, he was someone who started as a Marxist in the 1970s as a Marxist sociologist, and he was someone who also was a contributor to self-organized artistic projects in the Netherlands. Yes, among others, when Mediamatic was still a kind of bottom-up journal for media theory, he was one of its contributing writers. Yes, Pimp was the exact opposite of someone who pretended to be from the people. I mean, he was kind of a dandy, an aristocratic dandy, right? Openly gay, driving in a limousine with 2 dogs. He was the absolute opposite of a proletarian or down to the earth person.
Right.
But through this kind of contrast, like being the extreme opposite, he managed to kind of appear authentic. Because then people said, oh, yeah, he's not one of these kind of professional politicians who pretend that they are of us, but he is what he is, right? He's this eccentric figure. And that's all. I think that's very interesting in all kinds of populist, but also in fascist movements, that very often the leader doesn't fit the bill at all. Yeah, I mean, in the case of the German Third Reich, and I should really make clear that I do not want to put Pimp in a comparison. I'm not. This is really another example. I don't want to compare him to the Third Reich at all. That would not be fair. But in the case of the German Reich, the leader was, of this Aryan Third Reich, where only blue-eyed blonde people should be the genetic future. The leader was an Austrian with black hair, right, and unclear birth certificate. But that's very typical. That very often populism has a negative element, a kind of self-denying element. It's also, I think, a frustration about what you want to be and what you aren't actually. Yeah. So
the self-denying element.
Or for example, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. You could only become a member of the SS if you were blonde and blue-eyed. But I think he wasn't even himself. No. And he tried to pass the physical exam of the SS, but couldn't. He was totally unathletic.
Really?
Yes. But that's very typical. I mean, that's very typical. That there's also this kind of moment of discrepancy or failure, but which then also gives, I think, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. That you say, we are imperfect, we are not living up to our own ideals, but we are still being accepted in this community. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, speaking about community, with the online culture that's like enabling a lot of things that were otherwise not possible before the internet and all these communities that are online. For example, I often tend to think that people behind keyboard are more courageous and more outspoken rather than when they are in real life, right?
Yes. Especially in America, because you see that America has much less a tradition of street activism than Europe.
Yeah. Also distances.
Yes, and you see that the alt-right always failed. It always ended in a disaster when they went on the street. And the first was Charlottesville, and the second was the storming of the Capitol.
Yeah, but then in the US it kind of works that people find each other through these like dark websites, or whereas maybe in Europe you still could sit in a bar and openly talk about.
Yeah, but I think in the US it also has to do with the physical distance.
That's right.
I mean, it's simply not easy to kind of gather 100,000 people in a city because people have to travel several thousand kilometers.
Yeah, exactly.
And then particularly also if he's speaking of the populist right, which is often rural and not in the cities, etc., etc.
True. You wouldn't expect to have a convention in New York, but you would see it in I don't know, south.
Yes. But where? I mean, even there, people would have to travel several thousand kilometers, right? And not like here. I mean, it's also you see also that let's say the populist phenomena are not just linked to politics, but for example, if you look at European football culture, right? That's also populist. Culture,
like hooligans.
Yes.
So regarding the community that is constantly feeling that they are underrepresented, unheard. In the last episode, I spoke about the priorities that are different within different nations. For example, I was addressing the COVID protests that people are angry. It could be as easy for somebody to be angry about not being able to have a drink late at night, enough for him or her to come out to the street and destroy public property. That could really make somebody that much angry. Well, at the same time, in West Asia, you could have somebody doing the same actions to go to the street because of really more basic rights. So the priority is also linked to privileges, let's say, of different natures from different locations. In the US is different, in West Europe is different. But I'm kind of thinking, thinking about expression and feeling unheard and like freedom of speech, something that a lot of people tend to maneuver around in populism, which sometimes then could shift to hate speech because then it's unclear sometimes which is which.
And what you always see in right-wing populist movements is also that the understanding of freedom of speech is not, let's say, that people feel that they're not allowed to say what they think because they're doing it all the time, right? I mean, that's what these movements do, that they articulate their opinions. But what they expect is to articulate their opinions and not receive critique. This is also what the whole, let's say, that the moral panic about cancel culture is, right? That people expect that they can say anything, but that there will be no resistance to it. And that's of course an understanding of freedom of speech that is completely how do you say it? It's completely surreal, or it's not grounded not even in a juridical or philosophical notion of the freedom of speech. I think it's basically also about let's say a feeling of loss of privilege. I think that the right-wing populist movements in the West are fundamentally a reaction, let's say an unacknowledged reaction to the change of social demographics, and that people feel, in particular white people, feel disenfranchised and say, we are no longer being heard, we no longer have the saying in our own society.
It's changing. Like the people don't like to see change around them, and then to see like different people coming in, taking jobs, or like the face of, for example, for Europe, for a long time now, they're saying that the demographic face of Europe is being changed by all the immigration. So the norms, let's say, values, all of these notions that are kind of
but especially the narrative on the populist right is, it's not. I mean, only if you go into the absolute extremes, you will have then narratives like all foreigners out, or all immigrants out, or or we ban homosexuality or queerness or whatever. That you will only find this in the most extreme fringes. But let's say what you have in the populist mainstream is that you say, yeah, there can be immigrants, there can be queer people, but they have to shut up because they do not belong. They are not. They are not the people. No? They are okay if they integrate, and integrate means you keep silent. You know, you behave like what is still imagined to be the majority.
The normal.
Yes.
So this anchor, normal.
Yes,
which is like
do normal, huh?
Do normal.
Yes, do normal. That's the ideology. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So do normal is like, well, for the listeners who don't know, in the Netherlands there's a party now in charge. I don't know if it's a hang government or it's just a majority, VVD.
Yes.
The party of Mark Rutte, who is the prime minister for a long time. They are a conservative party that they're
officially even a liberal party.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah,
yes.
That's where I'm headed. So, like, officially liberal, as Florian says, but they are known to be conservative. And in 2000 and I think, when was the last election? 16 or? 17?
The last election was a year ago, actually.
No, I mean before that.
That was in 2017. Yes.
17, right. So in 2017 was like, it was 1 year after Trump was elected, and fascist and extreme right were kind of saw that, well, this is possible, maybe why not in Europe. So, and we have a politician, Geert Wilders, who then in the Netherlands gained a lot of attention after election of Donald Trump, and so the whole rhetoric of the middle, the conservative, kind of shifted then towards right. So if there's like an anchor point for the middle conservatism, there was a time that it shifted to the right, and then so the left became the middle, kind of, right? And then there was this very famous slogan, normal doen.
Yeah, it was part of a letter that Mark Rutte wrote to the Dutch people. Yeah,
normal doen or leave.
Yeah, exactly.
Do normal or leave.
Or go away, yes.
So that was kind of like a shock for a lot of people to see like a supposedly liberal leader saying that thing, only because...
It's an old Dutch saying, right?
Yeah.
Do normal.
And
it's also part of, I would say, the Calvinist cultural tradition.
Right.
Which means to be disciplined as a society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
to put your eccentricities, let's say, live them out in your private space, but not in the public. That's a Dutch idea, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't rock the boat.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
But now we have Le Pen and Macron in France also. Yes. So the same thing is kind of happening. They are the two front runners. So like whenever this is happening, you see this shift towards right only because you wanna, as a politician, gain more attention from also the supporters who might be in front of you, so they could be behind you, right?
But in France, it's maybe even more complex because again, the Macron government is very comparable in its ideology to the Rutte government in the Netherlands, in that most of all and what its real agenda is, it's like pro-business neoliberalism. Yeah? That's what it's really about. I mean, even with Mark Rutte, you could say he dresses up as a right-wing populist whenever there are elections, but the real agenda is tax breaks to allow international hedge funds to buy up the real estate in the Netherlands and for international companies to have tax-free shelters here in the Netherlands. That's what it's really about. Yeah? And also, by the way, with Pimp Fortuyn, it's really interesting. I mean, I can really recommend it. There is now a TV series on Pimp Fortuyn produced by the Dutch public TV, which is really good. I must say, it also has some grotesque elements, but what it underlies is that the people who backed Pimp Fortuyn were real estate speculators. Yeah, and I mean that's what's always behind it. You know, there's always there is economic interest in it.
Of course,
Yes, and there's a beautiful scene in the series where the driver of the Social Democratic top candidate has a mother who lives here in Rotterdam in Spangen, and I'm not sure whether it's authentic or whether they invented it for the series, and lives in a slumlord apartment, and where nothing is done, and where they basically try to the landlord tries to pester her out of the place by not repairing it, then out of protest that back then the Social Democratic government didn't do anything for it, then the chauffeur votes for Pimp Fortuyn. But actually the main financier of Pimp Fortuyn, of the party, was that slumlord, you know, which is true. I mean, it's really true that the slumlords were the ones who also gave free offices to Pimp Fortuyn's party, later to Rita Verdonck's party, etc., etc. Yeah. So that is also, I think, you can say on the level of professional politics, populism is often a strategy, and it's the same with Donald Trump, right? It's exactly the same. There were business interests. Yeah, there were business interests, and you use a populist rhetoric. You present yourself as the man of the people, but what you really do, and it's also the same with Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Duterte in the Philippines, etc. What they all do is, you know, feed some crumbs to the masses, and while actually doing politics for their own business interests. Yeah, and that's in a way, probably you could say it's a political recipe. You know, that goes back to the Roman Empire and exactly. Yeah, and the Panem Circenses. So give the people bread and circus games, and then they will be happy and you can take good care of yourself as a political leader. Yes.
So my question would then be, well, the average person, this keeps happening, this keeps repeating itself in different forms and shapes, and people tend to kind of be able to distinguish between something that is repeating itself when it comes to maybe different cases. Well, I'll get to that election later, but I'm just wondering what keeps happening that the average person is always lured to the idea of populism and keep doing the same thing over.
Yeah, well, because I think there are legitimate concerns that the political system doesn't serve the people. Right. I mean, yes. I mean, if you now live in Rotterdam, and for example, you can no longer find an affordable house, that's a complaint, right? I mean, it's it is. I mean, it is something. In our teaching with autonomous practices, we also deal with kind of self-sustaining systems. And the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann had this theory that any kind of organization, in the end, is mostly concerned about its self-preservation. Yeah. So at some point, and the same, of course, happens with politics. At some point, you get a self-referential system. And we also know that, I mean, we know that from our school, at some point, also these organizations become self-referential, and they kind of lose track of what their real community care should be. And it's difficult. I think it's difficult with any kind of bureaucratic organization. It's very easy to say, it's because of bureaucratic complexity, it's because it's abstract, because it's detached, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, this is also the dilemma that we face when we teach autonomous self-organization in our classes. That very often, if you are a community project, self-organized, and you work with informal structures, then you don't have these problems of detachment and let's say misrepresentation or not seeing what's actually happening. But you're also vulnerable to other things, such as, for example, unsafety on the work floor, power structures that are invisible but very strong, things that happen, where you then need to introduce policies, right? But when you introduce policies and when you then kind of professionalize the organization, then you become self-referential. I don't know a way out of this. Yeah.
Well, that's what you say. All institutions they become self-referential, or like they just to be sustainable.
Yes.
So it then comes to...
And we also know it from the art world, which is highly self-referential, right? It's a similar way where you also say that art should really be for the people. Yeah, we know that this is a fiction. Yeah, and even, there is no other word which has such an inflation in the contemporary art system as care. You could say it's almost a joke. The less real care there is, the more the word is being used.
It becomes that's the thing with maybe also with political correctness. That's kind of the same thing, because that is something that, again, the populists are always trying to kind of address or undermine the political correctness, the language that is being kind of advertised or turning into a mainstream now.
But of course, it has to do with the power relations. Huh? Yeah. First it was called political correctness. Now it's being called woke, and this is also being weaponized by the ones who disagree with it. But what, for example, these language politics really about is about representation of marginalized people, and then again, and there exactly you get this culture clash where then when you have the kind of right-wing populist standpoint where you say, the people is like, it's a physical body, right? It's an organic idea of the people. It's like, and that's also a fascist idea, I must say. That's the idea. Let's say we are a community, and the community is, is like an organic whole. Yeah, and anything that doesn't fit it is something like a virus, an intruder, something that we need to push out.
Right.
And that's was also very much the ideological basis, for example, of National Socialism in Germany. To say the German people, we are an organic unity, and there's an organic unity between the Führer, Adolf Hitler, and the people. They speak the same voice. They are like one whole. One whole. Yeah. By the way, you have this fascist ideology. You wouldn't expect it, but in the popular 1920s film Metropolis, which was actually written, the screenwriter was a National Socialist, Thea von Habu, and it's also about it's about class conflict between the workers and the factory owners, but then this is being resolved through an organic unity. Yeah, and where it says, there is the mind and there's the body. So the mind are the leaders and the body are the workers, and they need to be connected through the heart. And that's also what we see again now in the contemporary movements like the Corona deniers. They say, it's about the heart, it's about feeling, it's about emotions. It's an emotional politics, exactly, right? But with this desire to have this kind of organic unity. And let's say a hostility towards anything that's abstraction, and that is something that is not that does not fit itself into this organic whole.
Exactly. Yeah, true. That kind of I can't help but think about when we're thinking about expressions, feelings. And agitations, and so kind of expressive kind of or feelings that unite people together, and when you think about what's happening online, most of these movements, most of the people who are then lured into different kind of topics don't even know what they are. for example, with QAnon in the States, with conspiracy theories.
That's sorry. But that's exactly something, what gives you, let's say, this kind of warm bath of belonging to a community and belonging to a whole.
Yeah, this sense of belonging and being taken care of, heard, being heard.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's like this emotionally attachments that unite a good number of people that then they can actually make some effect that otherwise would then be deemed unimportant. Or like ridiculous or not even.
Yes, but the interesting thing is if we identify these kind of desires as populist, that if we take the political philosophy of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau and their concept of populism, it's the opposite. Yeah, their concept of populism is based on antagonism and actually on acting out differences. And saying also we do not need to resolve differences, but we should have conflict in society, and society should be able to sustain conflicts, not always resolve it. And which, by the way, reminds me immediately of the Office of Inclusivity report about our school, which said that exactly this is lacking, this kind of readiness to also accept that you cannot agree on something.
That was the report that this doesn't exist.
Yes. Which said that there is, let's say, shying away from conflict and trying to kind of harmonize everything through Gezelligkeit, and not acknowledging that you can have differences of positions. And that's actually this idea, that you do not need to resolve a conflict, but that you can just keep it, that you can have antagonizing factions within society, and that's okay. They don't need to resolve their antagonism. That's the core of the concept of populism by Laclau and Mouffe, which is almost the opposite of what we just described as populism before, right? So there's the idea actually that in the moment where, for example, the people go on the street and they protest something, for example, the housing crisis in the Netherlands, then it is good to have this antagonism and to keep up this antagonism.
Yeah, because otherwise you will not be generating a dialogue or.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, their philosophy was based again on a fascist German philosopher and legal theorist Carl Schmitt, who was maybe next to Heidegger the only kind of remarkable intellectual in the Third Reich, attached to the Nazi Party, and he had the same concept, but then coming from fascism, says there always needs to be an enemy. You can only unite society if you fight against something, and even if the enemy doesn't exist, you need to invent the enemy.
Well, I'm very familiar with that.
yes. And we see how this is a memeing strategy, how this ties in with populism, because just this weekend I went to the flea market, which I often do on weekends, and on my way back from Vlaardingen I was at Marconi-Plein station, and there was a sticker, and it showed the heads of Rutte, we mentioned him before, Sigrid Kaag, who is from the other Liberal Party coalition partner, and then behind them Soros and Bill Gates, and then it says the big reset, you will own nothing, speaking to the people, and so these are the people who are betraying you. And then there were the party logos of all Dutch parties, including the party of Geert Wilders. The only party that was not there with the logo was Forum for Democratie by Thierry Baudet, so they were actually the ones who made the sticker, right? Now, the reason why I mention this, because it uses, George Soros has become this meme, right? Mm-hmm. This anti-Semitic and both anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist meme. But the thing is that the idea to build up Soros as this kind of arch enemy was actually invented by, you won't believe it, two Jewish, Israeli and American political campaign managers. And the thing is, we know Viktor Orban, who also does populist politics in Europe, and who is a big friend and a good collaborator of Benjamin Netanyahu. And at his second last, Orban just won his elections, but in the elections before, the problem was there was no more opposition in Hungary. Yeah.
Right.
So he didn't know how to campaign, and then Netanyahu told him, "I'm really not making this up." Netanyahu told him, "I have two really good managers. I sent them to you. They will think something up." And the guys were really good. They said, "Yeah, George Soros, he's perfect, because
they created one."
Yeah, they created one. George Soros didn't even live in Hungary, but he's of Hungarian origin, and then he's this kind of capitalist, globalist, and Jewish on top of that. I didn't mention it in the campaign, but it was an anti-Semitic campaign. And this was the origin of the George Soros meme. Yeah. And now you saw how it spilled over into the kind of general kind of meme discourse of the populist right. So, for example, George Soros and Bill Gates, they want to inject microchips with the vaccinations, corona vaccinations. Huh? Yeah, it comes from there. It's the Schmittian theory of if there is no enemy, you have to create the enemy in order to unite the people and mobilize the people.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot. Yes. It's kind of all right. So then that then goes back to what you said about the populism being complex and then different ways of explaining it.
Yes. The interesting thing is that populism can both this ideology that is about harmonizing and unifying and having this fascist idea of the kind of organic unity of the people, but it can also be this kind of adversarial, contrarian idea. And maybe this is also the kind of paradox of contemporary capitalism, both. Especially if you look now at the Western European populist movements, like the corona deniers, they have both. They have the kind of contrarian, countercultural elements, and they have the idea of the community care and the organic unity of the people, etc., etc.
Right.
And this is also something, I would say the alt-right, when it started in the mid-2010s, it was more contrarian, adversarial, and now it has morphed into this kind of corona denier hippie discourse where it is both, and maybe because of that even stronger. With QAnon you have the same thing. It also has this combination of like Christian camps, Christian communities. This QAnon group, for example, which is on Dallas and waiting for the resurrection of John F. Kennedy. Are you familiar with them?
Oh, wow.
Yes, yeah. And I think they've been there on the airport now for 3 months or something like this.
Waiting for
yeah, but the newest theory is actually that Donald Trump is John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I can't keep up.
They even compared photographs that actually, John F. Kennedy was not really killed, but he went underground and then he gave himself a new identity. It's actually Donald Trump.
Yeah, but we laugh of it, but there are people in Dallas waiting.
Yes. That's also the thing, I think, for us both, working in the arts. That is maybe also the fascination with it. There is an enormous amount of creativity in it.
Exactly. I've heard in QAnon there was this writer who was a failed Hollywood writer, and he kind of went under this username there, and then he started writing, and then people bought it, so he became this strong figure. I forgot the username. Yeah. But actually, a lot of these things that the Democrats are harvesting babies and eating them.
Yes.
These kind of things are coming. But in thinking about all of these different forms of populism, I cannot help but think about the vulnerability of the people.
Yes.
So it's what they have all in common is the vulnerability, because there is some of these concerns or problems or issues might come from legitimate problems, like for example in the Netherlands with the housing crisis, or in the US with the middle class Americans, right? or in France with the actual immigrant problem that they have in Calais
and the deterioration of the countryside in France, right?
Yeah.
The impoverishment of the countryside versus the cities. Yeah. And while Macron, just like Obama, is kind of pampering the kind of new entrepreneur startup class. Yeah?
Exactly.
Yes.
So, but what then happens is that the vulnerability of people is then taken advantage of by whoever is riding that wave. Okay, so I have not in mind a recent or a modern example of populist leaders who have actually had good at heart.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, what I find so striking and remarkable, and I think that's really the difference to early 20th century European fascism, is that most of these movements are leaderless. Yeah. QAnon is pretty much a leaderless movement. The alt-right also was leaderless. I mean, some people tried to be its leaders and failed, like Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos. They all disappeared very, very quickly. They're pretty much self-organized. And I would also say what is so attractive about them is that there are I co-wrote an article on this with Roberto Bui from the Wu Ming Writers Collective in Italy. We said actually these are like collective role-playing games, live action role-playing games where everyone is a co-author of the game. You know? It's you're part of a kind of action movie more or less, or adventure movie, and you're co-writing the plot. Yeah. This is also how it works. I mean, for example, the QAnon, that you were just given these kind of fragments, the crumbs of information that didn't make any sense on 4chan and 8chan, and then you start elaborating on them and making hypotheses and speculations, and then you turn this into a narrative. That's, I think, the appeal. That means it gives people agency. Yeah, so it allows people, to tell the story again, to get a grip on the narrative, very literally. Yeah.
True. But this kind of that every person is actually a co-author. That is interesting. But I mean the systems that are in place and the tools that are there for actual legitimate and legislated change are at the moment representative systems that in the end they will be the ones who, I mean this will be the system that will be then implemented in the end, right, to organize the community or the country or
but we can of course think of better systems of political participation. We can say even in the model that now exists in Western democracies like the Netherlands, there are models that are 100 years old, and they are based on certain parameters and also technologies that maybe are dated. But on the other hand, I'm skeptical whether improved participation. I mean, I'm familiar with your projects. For example, if something like liquid democracy, which came up in the context of the pirate parties about 10, 15 years ago, whether this is going to solve the legitimacy crisis, because in the end, it also adds one more technological layer or one more abstraction layer. And the idea of the populist movements is to remove abstraction. Yeah, that there is like an organic will. It's like we are on the streets, we are uttering what we want, and this should be immediately listened to. This should be immediately executed. Yeah, we are having our demands right now, and there shouldn't be even any kind of mediation layer between us and politics, and that's the essence of populism, at least of right-wing populism, to say, why are you not acting? Yeah, we are here. We are the people. We want this to happen.
With populism, it's often emerge in a state of emergency, anger, frustration, emotional charged demands, but then we have a more increasingly lack of participation by
Yes.
But in the elections going on
in Rotterdam, we had less than 40% of voters at the municipal elections. Yes. Mm.
So we had this in the city of Rotterdam. That was for the social housing election a few years ago. That was the same. Not even enough people signed up, so that they didn't have the referendum even.
Yes.
So. Yeah, that's the thing. Like with, if there are so many angry people going in the street against COVID restrictions, where are they when they're supposed to be voting? You know. So
and it's also something where I don't have an answer, because I would even say, as someone who has been living in the Netherlands since 16 years, I would say compared to other countries, the possibilities of political participation in the Netherlands are actually quite good. They're not that bad. Yeah. It's only that people don't know what is possible. So, for example, that as a citizen, you can go to the city hall and have the right to, it's called speak in, to grab the microphone and voice demands, and also demand, basically urge a statement or that it's even an obligation then for politics to react on your demands. There are many possibilities also with the decentral politics, with the so-called neighborhood councils, etc. It's better than in many other countries, actually. So I mean, before I would subscribe to a diagnosis of a representation or a system crisis, I think you also have to look at the other side, that people are not really making use of the existing tools of participation.
Exactly, like we had at the university where we were teaching, the participation council. Nobody knew about it.
Yes.
Until so it was kind of. There are many different tools that are out there, but people just don't know about it because nobody seems to bother.
Yes.
Right? When it comes to engagement with changing or like affecting the regulations or the system actually. But this also comes, I mean, the lack of participation in election for me is kind of maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there's people kind of don't think it works anymore, or they just don't seem to care about, because it doesn't matter if the face is changed. It's just the same thing over and over again, right? Yeah. So then there's this frustration.
But there's also a problem, right? If you want to become active, or if you actually want to take a role in political decision making, it's enormously laborious. Yeah, that's also a problem. I mean, first of all, becoming involved in most of the cases requires that you're economically privileged. So, for example, if you're living from welfare, it's almost impossible to even have the time to even, let's say, run as a participation council candidate or whatever. That's number one. And number two, I mean, even the people who do that, for example, I must say, through my own political activism, I developed a lot of respect for the people on the city council, despite even when they're making terrible decisions, because it's an incredibly laborious job with shitty payment where you cannot live from. So everyone who's on the city council needs to have some other job. Or they need to be rich, right? Like the VVD Karemans, who became rich as a startup entrepreneur and can do politics as his hobby.
Vincent Karemans.
Huh? Yes. Yes. The White Knight, the Batman of Rotterdam. Yes.
You should see the trailer for his campaign. That's very what I'm referring to. Anyway. I mean, there is just so much things to discuss about.
Yes, but the question is, I mean, the question for your podcast is, because we're now really going deeply into politics, is can we improve this through better participation means? Let's not even call it technologies, but means. Yeah. Is it also a technical problem?
Well, yeah, because this is like a main problem that there is with project open source governance is that so a question that kept repeating or coming back when we had like public sessions was that, all right, you have direct democracy, you have liquid democracy, and you don't have representatives. How do you then stop the or like prevent, or how do you come up with a mechanism that prevents the majority in going towards a really like disastrous destination? But at the same time, what is disaster? Right? Maybe something that I call disaster for somebody else is pure heaven, right? But anyways, the extreme, let's say extreme actions can often rise from a majority of people who seem to, for an unclear reason, follow something that nobody would have expected, right? So the mechanism that is needed for that kind of leaderless politics is still one of the biggest problems of the design of this research, you know.
And I think there are two role models for this. I mean, you already mentioned open source and the open source movement, which under that name has existed since 1998. And you see that there have been lots of governance conflicts in open source projects. I mean, first of all, in the open source initiative, which is, like, say, the guardian of the term open source and the author of the open source definition itself, which was started as a kind of right-wing libertarian organization, and then had several kind of governance changes. You see that there's a lot of conflict, also generational conflict in open source projects about codes of conduct, where, let's say, the older and more cyber hippie libertarian generation is strictly against it, and the younger kind of intersectional queer feminist generation is in favor of it. And you see that this is also becoming a huge problem for some projects to still find then a common ground. And but also, let's say, in the non-digital sphere and much older, I think Switzerland is a really good example of indeed a direct democracy, also more or less leaderless. I mean, the top politicians in Switzerland are not even really well known, because it's very much a kind of collective model of governance, and with lots of citizen participation, but where we also seen in the past 20 years how such a system can be perfectly weaponized, especially by the extreme right, in this case the Swiss People's Party, which also has, let's say, powerful business interests behind it. And where then now the referendum system is mostly one where you have another referendum to kick out all foreigners from Switzerland, and it's mostly about people mobilizing to kind of downvote that referendum, right? That's
they have a referendum for everything.
Yes. But often they are very reactionary, and actually you go to the referendum not in order to enable something, but to prevent something, which is being asked in the referendum. I think that has become more the kind of normality.
Interesting methodology. So there are all, like you say, there are all of these like methods from old and new. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is to kind of put all of these like puzzle pieces together to kind of create a proposal, let's say.
Yes, but maybe we just need to get rid of the idea that there is somewhere the perfect system.
No, exactly.
Yes,
that's what I like about open source, because it keeps evolving itself, or changing, or coming with new versions. So then because if it is supposed to be something that doesn't. That is like established, then it becomes establishment. Then that what you said about every system trying to sustain itself.
Yeah, but what you see in open source software is, of course you have permanently new versions, and you can be, I don't know, on the GitLab or GitHub up and follow the changes in real time. Yes, but that is more on the level of, let's say, execution or development But on the level of governance, where you, for example, have the licenses, and then on top of the licenses, you have the definitions, the free software definition of the GNU project and the aforementioned open source initiatives, open source definition, plus the Debian free software guidelines. These are the three kind of documents that describe what qualifies as free software and open source. Then you see that it's really difficult to implement changes on those definitions.
Right.
They have been in place now for 30 years. And also it's really difficult to even change the licenses, although the licenses are already one level lower than these definitions. And you could argue that there's a big problem with the definitions, because what we have seen with free software and open source is that while it prevented the proprietization of software in the style of, for example, Microsoft, it didn't help the platformization of software. Yeah? So, for example, services like Twitter and Facebook, Google, they all run on open source software. They run on Linux, MySQL, Apache, etc., etc. But the kind of proprietary applications they built on this free software stack, they are not open source because the licenses do not cover, for example, something like web services or distributed applications. This has been a problem, and this is simply a legacy from the fact that the Free Software Foundation was started in the 1980s, where these kind of services didn't exist. Yeah. And it was meant for locally installed computer software. And I happen to personally know Richard Stallman, actually.
Yeah.
He lived in my apartment in Berlin in 1998 for a couple of weeks. Yeah. I can tell you many anecdotes about Richard Stallman. But he was back in...
he was the founder of Linux.
Of the GNU project, which is even older than Linux.
Okay.
Which started in 1983, the Free Software Foundation and GNU. He still, 15 years ago, he said, I only care for software freedom. For me, only concerns what you run on your own computer. But for me, it doesn't entail what people run on their servers. So Google for him was not a problem. And we still haven't gone beyond that. So I'm not sure whether free software is more flexible in its governance.
Well, this is kind of like you say, there is no perfect system, but you can always but this system that is here now with the representative system is kind of like a few hundred years old. So
it's really old. It's even. There's so many people who, for example, think that the monarchy is absurd in the Netherlands, and also costing a lot of money and being essentially, let's say, the public financing of an oligarch family. It seems almost impossible to get rid of the monarchy. Yes, and the Dutch monarchy is even, it was created by Napoleon during the French occupation of the Netherlands. And the Netherlands were a republican country. We still cannot get rid of it. Yes.
But we can go on forever. This is I'm really enjoying this. We started from populism. You covered a lot. You are really much knowledge on on a lot of subjects. I really appreciate.
We're probably going over time and have to cap it at some point, otherwise we keep talking for 24 hours. Or maybe that would be, that's the future, a non-stop talk, that it becomes really a durational performance to talk about governance. And that's the best way. Yeah?
But what you say really triggered me with like a no perfect system, and having this podcast, I think. It's more about conversation. Let's just the conversation that keeps producing, and rather than hyper focusing on creating a design. I think that's kind of maybe more interesting. That's really like whatever what we talked about. I think it's we covered
yes.
like 5 episodes.
Okay,
so concentrated. But yeah, thank you very much, Florian.
Yeah, thank you, Panda. That was a good conversation. So I'm looking forward. I need to catch up with the rest of your podcast.
Yes, I will try to kind of follow up on this episode to generate the next episode or the topic for the episode. Your contribution was really appreciated. I thank you very much. And yeah, until next episode. Bye. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Florian Cramer about populism. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. It's very important to keep the conversation and discussions going in this project since it's all about sharing information and collectively creating together. Speaking of collectively creating together, there are some important announcements I would like to share with you. First one is about creating a community for open source governance. In order for us to be able to more closely work together with people who are interested in this subject and the existing members of the project Open Source Governance and new members who would like to join, I have created a Discord server for open source governance. On the Discord server, you can talk about a whole different range of topics, from talking about politics, governance, programming, Web3, and discussions in the podcast, to introducing resources and also just for hanging out. The announcements and the events also are more regularly shared here and it's easier to follow. The link to the Discord channel is on the Twitter page and on the website of Open Source Governance. Our Twitter is Project OSG. I would like to encourage you, if you use Discord, please join this server because there will be a lot happening here. The other announcement is about article submission. There will be a new section and hopefully a publication made from the articles that are shared with open source governance, and we are planning to create a blog on the website where you can send and we will share your article on the website for the whole community. This will be an ongoing process and there is not a submission deadline yet, and we will leave this open for the future. So if you would like to send an article in a later stage, or if you're hearing this a long time after the release of the episode, feel free to still send your articles because new topics keep coming up. So please, if you have something to share with us regarding open source programming, governance, politics, and whatever you feel that they are relevant to what has been discussed so far in the podcast, you can send your articles to info@opensourcegovernance.com. If we can gather a nice collection of articles, we will try to print this as a publication and distribute it as a zine, and hopefully we can do this as an annual program. By the way, text is not necessarily the format for this publication. If you think of other forms, a drawing, a sketch, an audio file, a video file, or a VR experience, whatever comes to your mind, we welcome all of them. After all, this started as an art project. Speaking of art, I would like to thank again CBK Rotterdam that enabled us to continue working on this podcast and have these wonderful conversations. Thanks for staying with me for this more or less longer episode. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and see you in the next episode. Have a nice day or night. Bye.